Karim, Folklore of Ireland Society, Coinleach Glas agus a Sowing Gmuniahandan and Sahanocht, Tanov, agus Tarvre, as an Ihebra, Arnan, the Bahagan and Nocht, Ihebra, Scaliocht, Shanachus Kjol, agus Dansa, or Bishon on their own son. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure to be able to address you here this evening on behalf of the Folklore of Ireland Society at what stands to be a fantastic night of music, of song, of dance, and of storytelling from our native tradition, all of which pertains to the theme of the harvest. And the harvest, ladies and gentlemen, is a period of fruition and a period of abundance, and it's a period of profusion and plenty. And it's a period when the entire community would come together as one and go out and travel to the fields to take in the crops newly ripened. And it's a period, likewise, that in marking the threshold of abundance was met with jubilance and celebration by our forebears. For in marking the threshold of abundance, it similarly marked the end of the hardship that had preceded that threshold, the hard months of June and hungry July, so-called, when the year's stores were traditionally at their lowest. So tonight, we celebrate the harvest, we celebrate that gathering up, that coming together, and we celebrate those who have diligently sown, those generations who have so diligently sowed before us, that we might now so richly reap. So the harvest, ladies and gentlemen, as I said, is a time of jubilance and a time of celebration. And as part of that, what we wish to present before you this evening are some of the fruits of the harvest. And those fruits pertain not just to the fruits of the earth, but likewise to those of the spirit. And so it's in view of this that we wish to present to you some of the varying strands from our traditional artistic expressions, those of music, those of dance, those of song, and those of storytelling. And it's important that in doing so, that we bear in mind the broader strands of which these are a unity, of which these varying strands come together to form the broader whole or the broader part. So it's important in celebrating these particular identities for their own, in celebrating music for music and dance for dance, that ultimately we recognise, as Luke Cheevers, who we're particularly lucky and glad to have singing with us this evening, recently mentioned in an interview given to the Irish Traditional Music Archive, that these varying strands, these traditional artistic expressions, are as the fingers of one hand. And that is to say that they don't exist independently of one another or in a vacuum or in a void, that these are the varying strands that form the unity of the whole. And so tonight it's that whole, it's that unity that we celebrate. We partake then of the fruits of the harvest that we might better understand the nature of the tree that bears them, and that tree is tradition itself. And so in this sense it's important that we think of tradition in this broadest kind of holistic sense. And tradition in this regard then, ladies and gentlemen, isn't some brittle or petrified fossil. Tradition is a vigorous and dynamic force, and it's a force in which the particular vital energies of our people, our community, find expression. And they find expression in our songs, in our stories, in our dance. They similarly find expression in our popular customs, in our beliefs, in our rites of passage, in our ritual observances, in our religious traditions, in our calendar customs, and in our traditional feast observances. And they find further expression in our material culture, in our built heritage, in our traditional dwellings, in our crafts, in our trades, in our implements, in our tools, in our traditional costume, clothing and dress. So it's very much the combination of these concrete and abstract manifestations that go to form the broad cultural heritage and landscape that we inherit, and that's what we celebrate tonight. And tradition is similarly a space in which the individual finds expression in the communal. It's a space, as the late Dáithí Hogan, Gnan Diagras there, used to quote, in which the wisdom of the many finds expression in the wit of the few. And tradition shouldn't be thought of then in that sense of some sort of errant flotsam and jetsam, or an ignorant or superstitious leftovers from some bygone or maladapted age. Tradition is in tradition we see the primary modes and vehicles of identity and meaning and belonging are spoken to us in a communal or an organic sense. So tonight we celebrate those varying strands and we celebrate the totality of the whole that binds them. So traditionally the harvest itself was conceived of as beginning and commencing on the 1st of August in Irish tradition. And this is known as Lunas or Lammas. But celebrations to welcome it typically commenced on the last Sunday in July on what was known as Garland Sunday. And Garland Sunday was a day that was typically, garland generally refers to a wreath of flowers, or more generally means a party. And there are a variety of different names used to describe this particular celebration. Other English language names for these observances are those of Big Sunday, Mountain Sunday, Height Sunday, Rock Sunday, Bilberry Sunday, Fhómhair Sunday. But despite the variety of different names pertaining to this celebration, they had a common theme. And that common theme was for groups and bands of young individuals in particular to gather at their local heights, mountaintops, hills and summits, and to gather there to sport and play for the day. In some instances, wreaths of flowers would be woven or scattered across hilltops. Bilberries, wild berries that had recently ripened would be eaten in their droves. There would be music, there would be dancing, and there would be the consumption of intoxicating liquors. Similarly, races and contests of athletics and strength, contests of varying kind of athletic forms, were similarly popular at these Garland Sunday hilltop observances. And in some instances across the country, men were known to race their horses into lakes and bays in a state of undress. This was a particular exuberance that drew scorn from the authorities of the day. In 1833, a magistrate wrote about the shameful custom and the disgraceful practice that pertained of young men riding their horses naked into the sea, into the water at this time. But similarly, these kind of horse swimming races occurred in Scotland, they occurred in France, and again, when we look at our folk traditions, they point us and place us in a wider framework or a wider European kind of cultural heritage. Duly scandalised by naked horse swimming, you will be no doubt suitably relieved to know that prayer and pilgrimage and reflection also formed an important part of the Garland Sunday celebrations. And this was a day that saw communities often would travel to their local graveyards, travel to blessed wells, travel to shrines or sites of devotion, and they would leave wreaths of flowers there, or there would be prayers and pilgrimage. And this finds its most popular manifestation in the current age with the tens of thousands of diligent pilgrims who climb to the summit of the Reek of Fhómhair on the last Sunday in July, on Garland Sunday every year. So Garland Sunday observances and celebrations focus on hilltop gatherings, celebrations, drinking, music, dancing, courtship, prayer, reflection, and moderate amounts of naked horse swimming through lakes for good measure. With Garland Sunday celebrations duly passing and the celebrations duly ceasing, the hard work of the harvest then commenced. And this was a time then that saw men and women from across their communities travel out to the fields to begin to carry in and to cut the corn, namely the wheat, the rye, the flax, the oat and the barley that had recently ripened. And so they would travel in their droves with their children, they would travel with their implements, their sickles and with their scythes to commence the hard work of cutting the corn and bringing it in. And although this was involved a laborious effort, there were certain individuals who were credited in folk tradition as having a supernatural charm that guaranteed that their reaping hook always had the sharpest of edges, and that they could mow enormous swathes of corn at little or no personal exertion to themselves. And so the individual who had urta on the ear, or edge charm, so-called, would write it down on a piece of paper before sewing it into their clothing, and then off to the fields to do their work for the day, where they would cut supernatural amounts of corn while their companions would struggle. Similarly, those who held this gift, some of them could share it on a mower on whom they might have taken pity, and simply by taking their blighted, rusted, useless implement, their scythe, their sickle, and by running their hand along it and handing it back, what would be handed back would be a kind of gleaming, perennially and perpetually sharpened implement that would then go on to cut vast amounts of corn, while your companion in the next field over or working further beside you was doomed to struggle, having to stop and to sharpen his blunted blade again and again and again in the heat and sweat of those long evenings. But the harvest was not only misery and struggle, you'll be also glad to learn, as a period or as a time in which men and women from across the community were joined together to work. It also served as a period in which tokens and items of affection and fancy were passed to and fro between individuals. And these find their most beautiful expression in the harvest knot. These are instances from Ulster that we can see the harvest knots. These were small and delicately plaited wisps of straw that were given as tokens of fancy and affection between men and women at this time working in the fields. They're often made from grass or from rye or flax or wheat, and taken by gathering strands of equal lengths together and beginning to plait them over one another in a delicate weave that was tied off at the ends. And the grain then that was worn by women had the seeds still intact, and those harvest knots worn by men, which you could see at the bottom, they had the grain cut away. So the women's harvest knots at the top and the men's at the bottom. And by the end of September, the hard work of carrying in the grain and of cutting the corn was due to nearly be complete, although no harvest was finished until the cutting of the last sheaf or last bundle of corn in the field had taken place. This was a moment that was treated with a certain symbolism, a certain joviality, and a certain reverie by those assembled. And the last sheaf, this last bundle of corn, was ceremonially plaited from bottom to top before being cut. And in some instances, reapers would stand back and throw their hooks at it, or sometimes being blindfolded and spun around before doing so to add to the hilarity. So this was a moment which was treated with a certain reverie, a certain symbolism, and a certain jubilation. And in some quarters, cutting the last sheaf was known as putting out the hair. The idea was that personified in the spirit of the corn, and in the last sheaf in particular, existed this particular animal spirit which would flee from the site of its final reaping. You have to bear in mind at the same time, as the field is being cut away, the birds and creatures in the field would gradually go to hide in this last sheaf that would then be cut, and the hair often would run out. And the shout sometimes sent to neighbours still cutting their corn was, "We sent you the hair." So you have this personification of the corn as an animal spirit, essentially. And this was common, again, as part of our wider European folk tradition. In other quarters in Europe, the spirit of the corn was sometimes known as a wolf or a fox or a hound, as a goose, a quail, a cow, a pig, a horse, even in certain instances. So this personification of the corn is a popular and widespread notion. Similarly, in terminologies surrounding the last sheaf, we often find it referred to in the feminine. So it's called the maiden. Here's the item of the last sheaf there. It's known as the maiden or the queen, while similarly being known as the cailleach, the hag, or the granny. So the notion being that there's the dual femininity present in the last sheaf. There's that which has ripened and provided abundance now, and there's that corn and that grain yet to provide future abundance in next year's harvest. So the harvest then was a time of jubilation, and the cutting of the last sheaf was met with great jubilation and cheering often as well in many parts of Europe. And to the individual who managed to cut the last sheaf of corn fell the responsibility of holding the clausur, or the harvest home. And this was an enormous party to which all were invited, and one that marked the end of the harvest and brought the harvest to a close. And often the lucky reaper who had managed to cut this final sheaf would be doused with drops of water or doused with drops of whiskey before this party would then commence. A party at which there would be freshly brewed beer, rounds of ribs, sides of bacon, new potatoes, health drunk, vast consumptions of food and drink, music and dancing late into the night, which, in due deference to tradition, I hope we'll similarly engage in ourselves this evening. So this harvest home celebration also had the last sheaf as its ceremonial centrepiece, and the last sheaf was hung above the door or hung in the rafters in order to provide profusion and plenty and bring it into the house for the following year, into the next harvest. Sometimes grain from it was handed and fed to the cattle or even to the family in the home to provide good health, good luck and profusion for the year ahead. So it was with the last sheaf hanging over the door and the rafters, and as gloomier and wetter weather began to approach at the end of September, that life would turn inward again in advance of the longer nights of winter, with the fields now lying fallow and bare. So this then tonight is our harvest home, ladies and gentlemen. This is our clausur, in which we observe and take part and enjoy the riches and fruits of tradition and the harvest, and those fruits that have been passed down to us across the generations in tradition. But after tonight's celebrations are over and done, and after we've gone our separate ways, what can an individual do in order to further kind of consider or come to a greater understanding of varying kind of cultural strands and different traditional expressions that exist in our society? You can do a great many things. A variety of different options are open to individuals who are inclined towards or are called to their own traditional culture or an exploration of it. You can visit the archives of the National Folklore Collection in University College Dublin. You can visit the Irish Traditional Music Archive in Merrion Square. You can visit the Pipers Club on Henrietta Street. You can visit the Museum of Country Life in Turlock House in County Mayo. You can visit the exhibition of Irish country furniture in Collins Barracks, the National Library, your own county library. You can consult local heritage groups in your own area. So there's a variety of cultural institutions and bodies that are there that can increase our own knowledge of our own cultural heritage and background. But there's a more fundamental thing that we can do at the same time, and this pertains in particular to the younger generation who are called to their songs or to the broader culture and our heritage in its broadest sense. And that is to go to the elderly people in your own community, in your own generation, to inquire of them about their customs, to inquire of them about their practices, their observances, their tendencies, their pastimes, their occupations, local legends, local lore of your own area. And in learning more about them, you'll similarly learn more about your own identity, those prior communitarian, communal heritage and traditionally informed forms that have maintained our prior conditions of our culture. So there are a great many things that we can do and expressions that we can engage in order to better understand and come to a sense of tradition ourselves. So it's in view of this harvest home that we celebrate tonight the harvest, the coming together of the harvest and the reaping of the various fruits that pertain to it. So let us keep our hands to the plough. Let us cut low and clean to the living earth. The energies of the harvest, as you'll see tonight, are in this room tonight. Let's see that the fruits and riches of that abundant harvest do not go to waste. Thank you.